I'm Christopher Lydon, and this is Open Source, retracing our steps out of the last bad dream era in American life. Michael Ansara was in the thick of that struggle too, around war and justice. The Hard Work of Hope is his memoir of many losses and his own big mistakes that come back 50 years later as lessons and light.
I have to take us back to that year of 1968, which was so amazing. A year of hope, a year of blood, a year of just surprise after surprise after surprise, and a year where history hinged. And in that year, we made some critical mistakes that we are feeling the impact of to this day. So we decided, the anti-war movement, or certainly SDS and the New Left, that politics was completely corrupt and that there was no difference. We used to say the lesser of two evils is still evil. And so when it came to the election of 1968 between Humphrey and Nixon, our position was vote in the street, vote with your feet. Don't vote. Don't participate in the elections.
I must have heard you because I didn't vote.
Right. Well, the voting age was 21, so a lot of us were too young. I was 21, and I didn't even register to vote. And, part of that was our disdain for the corrupt liberals who had been managing the country and prosecuting the war, and Humphrey's refusal to break with the war until the very last stage of the campaign. It was a half-hearted break. It wasn't a real one. And so I would say we weren't wrong in our assessment of Humphrey, a tired, sad liberal whose political life had been exhausted. Where we made our mistake was that we really had a failure of political imagination about how bad Richard Nixon could be. What would happen if you had an insecure man with tons of grievances who had no respect for the Constitution? And we saw him start a series of things. He, with his Southern strategy, started the Republican Party down the path of white grievance and becoming the party of Trump to this day. And he also was willing to flout all sorts of laws. The Watergate one is the one we all know about, but what's less well known is his agreement with J. Edgar Hoover to absolutely unleash the FBI on particularly black militants, but also on the New Left and the anti-war movement. And in the Chicago Convention of 1969, which was a disaster, this is the SDS convention, not the Democratic Convention of 68, which was also a disaster, but in the SDS convention of 1969, where SDS blew apart, we now know that there were 160 FBI informants and agents and provocateurs. Now, I don't believe...
Taking the place of the old communists who were,
Right. By the way, here's the irony of that. So there was a big split between the self-described Maoists of the Progressive Labor Party and what became the Weather Underground. And Hoover recognized the Maoists as his familiar enemy, the Leninist enemy that he had fought for so many decades. So he instructed the agents to support the national office folks who became weathermen. So you have this irony of ironies. And by the way, I don't believe that the craziness of 68 and 69 is simply because there were provocateurs. Yes, there were provocateurs, but I think the New Left that had spearheaded the anti-war movement since 1965 just went crazy. And there are lots of reasons for that, but the foremost one was the weight of the war and how it just, we'd get up every morning and you'd think, if I don't do better, more people will die, both in Asia and in the black communities of America. I have to be better. I have to do something. And it became a place where a political frame of mind for many of us, where America was an irredeemable country. And, we would cite the genocide of the indigenous people, the history of slavery, the imperialism, the foreign wars and the coups. And we would say, America is irredeemable. When you get there, you really lose the possibility of campaigning for serious reforms, for being strategic. It's all or nothing, which usually means nothing.
Michael, you're owning up to big mistakes that are still with us. And the dark side of this story is offset. I just want to lay it out as a fundamental premise in your book that even now, your belief in organizing and in democracy includes the notion that we can scare ourselves straight about what really counts. That democracy wants to heal itself is a sort of natural process, almost like the human body. And the example for you and for others is the civil rights movement of the 60s that preceded it, that didn't have natural support, didn't have media or institutional or establishment support, and yet an unqualified win after 10 years, whatever.
I mean, you think about when Rosa Parks refused to stand up and leave the seat at the front of the bus, 1955. I don't think anyone thought that 80 years of Jim Crow, both the laws and the terror that enforced it, was about to be massively challenged, let alone overthrown. And it came about because of the courage of so many people, particularly young Black students and young African American ministers who dared to be so bold, so courageous in the face of such continuing violence. They were arrested, they were beaten, front porches and Black churches were bombed, and people were murdered. And despite all that, they got tens of thousands of ordinary Americans, Black Americans in particular, to step out of their daily routine, their ordinary lives, and do extraordinary things. And now the history is told. It's really so interesting. Take the 1963 March on Washington. I was lucky enough to be the assistant New England bus captain with Archie Epps as my director. He was coordinating the buses, and I was working for Archie, who later became a dean, the first Black dean at Harvard.
Archie, I knew him well.
Yeah. And so right now the history is Martin Luther King gave an amazing speech, I Have a Dream, and everybody loved it. The whole country must have been united. And that's completely wrong. More than 2/3 of the country opposed that march, said it shouldn't happen, and didn't embrace it. You know, it's only these years after where legal segregation has been abolished, though I think we face a tremendous attempt to roll back the gains of those days. But I go back to that because when I was young, very young, 13, 14, 15, I was mentored by an amazing group of Black organizers in Boston. And they taught me that people can change. And they taught me that if you organize and come together, you can win campaigns. You know, the most significant one for me was Continental Bakery, which produced the ubiquitous white bread, Wonder Bread, had a factory right in the middle of Roxbury, right in the middle of the Black community, and refused to hire any Black person for anything other than the most menial janitorial jobs. And Noel Day and Reverend Breeden, Sarah Ann Shaw, and others organized something called the Boston Action Group, BAG. And we went door to door in the Black community, built a system of block captains. We enlisted every African American minister in the city, and we launched a boycott of Wonder Bread. And after weeks of an effective boycott, Wonder Bread gave in and actually hired 7 or 8 African American men in good paying jobs. And I saw what could be done through organizing and collective action. And what then happened was, even with just the slightest threat of boycotts, major Boston banks and other institutions began to hire and open up their jobs for African Americans. And a segregated workplace got desegregated. But it was through organizing and action. And what that convinced me is that the muscles of really democratic citizenship can work.
Democracy works, as you say,
work.
And you keep saying. There are other fundamental premises besides that. One, that liberals are usually the problem from year to year, decade to decade. Also, that nonviolent direct action is usually the solution. But a big one, organizing itself is misunderstood. what it is, what organizers do. It's not about making lists. It's not about mobilizing. It's not about canvassing. What is it in your view that gives that word almost magical power? The organizer.
Right.
What's he doing? What's she doing?
Right. So years ago, I was told organizers organize organizations. Such a simple statement. But so the difference between mobilizing and organizing is that in mobilizing, you're asking people to come out to a demonstration as individuals for one time or another time, but you're not building organization. Or you're organizing, you say, to win an election, but what you're really doing is mobilizing people saying, I want you to vote, but you're not building small teams and organizations that can persuade their neighbors over and over again who to vote for and to vote. So the heart of organizing is engaging with people. You're not selling something.
I was just going to say, it's not selling something, it's connecting.
Absolutely. You have to. So I'll go back to the anti-war days at Harvard. You know, everybody remembers the demonstrations and they think, oh, the 60s, all those demonstrations. What they don't understand is the amount of time spent in dorms or between classes talking to young people about the war. But those discussions weren't just about the war. They were about our lives, our hopes, our fears. What did our parents expect? And remember, we're 18, 19, 20-year-old kids. We're wrestling with how do we have a moral life, all the decisions, all the pressures. And so you'd have to engage that as well as talking about the war. And no one's changed in one conversation. But you have to connect. You have to find and establish areas of commonality and surface what people's hopes are and their fears, and then convince them first that these are shared problems, and secondly, that collective action can actually have an impact.
Is this what Bill McKibben does? I take him as one of the paramount successes of organizing, one by one, and now in his new thing for old folks.
Yep. The third act is absolutely an effort to organize people of my generation and slightly younger, and they're trying to do it systematically and they're trying to do it carefully. You know, I'd also say Indivisible is trying, though it often ends up doing more mobilizing than organizing, but they're really trying. And right now, I think we're doing well on the mobilizing, but we're doing less well on the organizing.
I keep wondering in your book, Michael, aren't you describing what MAGA has done to take over the country, virtually?
In a sense, yes.
And they affiliate beyond a vote. They're making groups all the time.
And they are campaigning at all levels. So they campaign about school boards. They campaign about what they call parent rights. They campaign about what's in your library. But they also start with a big advantage. They have the evangelical churches. They have the Right to Life movement. They have the NRA and the broader gun rights movement. They often have local chambers of commerce. They've had support from farmers' organizations. So they start with a very organized base. Whereas on our side, we have a declining union movement, which has been really shrunk dramatically over these last decades. And we have some of these new organizations that have come up, and we've got maybe black churches and gay rights organizations, but we don't have that deep institutional, community-based organizing that the right has.
But I wonder, could the Democrats, progressive people, have had a good shot at some of those foundational organizations, including a lot of churches?
I think so, but they would have had to be organizing. They would have had to be talking about issues that resonated with, all sorts of people across the country. And the problem is that the academic left has been focused on a set of issues and a purity of politics that really isn't based on practice, on organizing, on engaging with large numbers of people.
Or even the way people fundamentally connect in neighborhoods, for example, or as school parents.
Right. And what we haven't done for 30 or 40 years is to have wave after wave of organizers, young organizers in particular, able and willing to go and build new organizations or revitalize old ones, existing ones, and bring a democratic small d agenda that connects with people's daily life. We saw an example of what is possible just recently in the New York mayoralty primary.
But we'll get to that.
Okay.
Key point. I'm just struck that you're explaining to the world what I didn't really understand is how MAGA got where it is. They understood all this somehow.
And, they've also really been effective with social media in a way that now all the progressives and Democrats are, okay, we got to catch up on social media. But the problem is that social media has algorithms that favor the most extreme, the most outrageous, favor conspiracy theories. And so there now have been millions of Americans who only get their information from social media, and it's dominated by conspiracy theories, right-wing lies, and disinformation. And I would imagine, don't know the facts, but I would imagine a certain number of Russian and Chinese and others at work in those fields as well.
Meaning?
Well, bots and disinformation campaigns. I mean, I think if you look at the 2016 election, the Russians very carefully targeted on social media black voters in places like Detroit and convinced them that they shouldn't vote. Not that they should vote for Trump, but that they shouldn't vote. And it was a clear, documented Russian disinformation campaign to favor Trump. It was probably the single best investment that Putin has ever made.
Speak to two general impressions I have about the difference these days. The Democrats are stuck with what I would call non-contagious wins, AOC classically. But that has not connected to a movement. It hasn't been repeated. It's part of what we want to discuss about Zoran Mamdani, whether that is a total one-off or connects to a movement. The Republicans seem to do movement work at the same time they're attentive to every single political contest.
I also think, the Democrats are afflicted by several things. One is that they are trying to be a very large big tent and not organized around a central, clear core of principles. The Republicans, the MAGA movement, is absolutely clear, which is whatever Trump says, that's what we're doing. And also a vision of a declining, overrun, dystopian America and a nostalgic yearning for an America that never existed. So that's an advantage they have. The other thing about the Democrats is for 30, 40 years now, the Democratic Party, which used to bill itself as the party of the common man or woman, has been enthralled to elites. Now, the elites in this case include hedge fund managers, but they also include college professors and presidents and movie stars, but it's still a elite movement. And so for the last several elections, the Democrats have been running as the party of the well-educated elite in defense of a status quo that doesn't work. And the Republicans have been running as the angry, aggrieved party saying you have to blow up the system that doesn't work and replace it. Now, of course, they're lying about what they're going to do, but it still was a very powerful appeal. And I think, the Democrats have to develop a program of economic populism that is willing to tackle some of the elites, including those billionaires and hedge fund managers who refuse to see even the slightest incremental tax increase on their billions.
Into this whole puzzle comes the utterly amazing Zoran Mamdani. We've got to fix him somewhere between the Democratic Party, which he's defeated and taken over. Is he the anti-Trump? Is he the cure for small d Democratic politics? A very attractive guy with an utterly instinctive mastery of cell phone video media, but also sensible propositions on free bus service, sounds like, city taxes on the very, very rich, among other things. Where do you place him in the kaleidoscope of our politics?
So, great candidate. Just a generational political talent. But also, as you say, a terrific message, which is the cost of living is too high and making it unbearable for many of us. 3, very savvy social media, very smart, But I think more important than the social media, he built an organization of 50,000. Let me say that again. 50,000 volunteers who knocked on well over 1 million doors. Those volunteers were primarily young people, and they talked to their peers. And the result was the election, the primary election, had as many voters under 45 voting as over 45. And that is something that had never happened in a New York election ever. So their organization turned things around. I'd also say, not talked about much, is that New York has a very innovative public financing of elections, which allowed Mamdani to get enough money to be competitive. I mean, Cuomo outspent him massively, but he had enough money to be competitive. And a lot of that was due to that innovative public financing. So I don't think you can do or should do in Des Moines, Iowa, what you do in New York. But I think the idea of having a clear populist message, having a commitment to organizing and to expanding the electorate, I think that's replicatable. And we'll see if over the next years that emerges or not. The other myth is, Chris, that there is a Democratic Party. I mean, there's no party. They're funders and they're consultants and they're committees. But, the test of a party, if it's a real party, is that it has voters that it can turn out, and it will hold its elected officials accountable to do what they said they would do when they were running. Well, the Democratic Party isn't a party. It can't turn out voters. The people who sit at the DNC don't command 10 million voters. And more importantly, they never hold any of their elected officials accountable for anything. So, it's a myth that there's a party there. And I think both parties have been hollowed out. We could talk for a while about that whole process, starting really with the election of 1960 and television, all the way through all the technological changes, all the money, the impact in money, that the parties have been hollowed out, but the Republicans have a much better command and control, disciplined, unified movement.
I'm going to disagree with you, Michael.
Yeah.
I'm thinking specifically of 2020, when Bernie Sanders really won Super Tuesday. Joe Biden didn't.
Right.
The room went dark for a couple of days, and Obama and the chieftains of that non-existent Democratic Party, you say, decided, no, we can't afford Bernie. We'll go with Biden. And he got a wonderful endorsement out of Black South Carolina, and he had it. But that was one case in which I think not only the party surfaced and protected itself, it thought, but doomed them. I think Bernie could have beaten Donald Trump in 2020.
So I don't know whether Bernie could have won or not. Don't know.
No, do I.
But I would slightly disagree with you. So I think you described accurately what happened.
The Clintons and Obama nominated Biden.
Right. No. Black voters nominated Biden. Bernie's weakness consistently was with older black voters. And if you look at who votes in Democratic primaries, the most liberal people vote, and black women in particular turn out in key states. And they are a core constituency that elects Democrats. And for whatever set of reasons, Bernie never clicked with them. To be honest with you, I think that if Clinton and Obama had sat on their hands with Clyburn's endorsement,
Right.
and black voters coming out, I think it would have occurred as it did. I mean, yes, there is a Democratic Party establishment, an elite, and they control a serious amount of money, and they also control the rules of the convention. So that's true. But, they don't control who votes. I wish they did. I wish they could turn out 80 million voters reliably, but they can't.
Come back to Mamdani for a moment. An important point. It's barely surfaced, but this is a city of New York mayoral candidate with a foreign policy. He grew up half his life in Uganda. His father is an extremely distinguished scholar about, among other things, the American role in the world, with a strong urge back off empire. He surfaced, to my eye, 15 years ago, but around Save Darfur. He said, no, keep your hands off Darfur. You don't understand it. It became the sort of liberal interventionist thing. We've got to do something good for black Africans who are being persecuted by Arabs. Mamdani surfaced in a way, and I interviewed him a long time ago on the point that, no, the American power is overextended everywhere, and it's part of the problem in the country in general, part of the distemper, I think, that we're suffering sort of empire fatigue. And Mamdani is a mayoral candidate who can explain that and can represent it, which also leads us to the matter of the war in Gaza and his outspokenness. He actually said that if Benjamin Netanyahu landed in New York, he'd arrest him for genocide. An incredibly bold move, which he's underlined and repeated. What do you make of that?
So I would say, by the way, Mamdani also has a wonderful mother, that amazing filmmaker,
absolutely,
who made a great movie about the civil rights movement.
Mira Nair. I've met her too.
Anyway, I think what's interesting is that his foreign policy positions, clearly articulated, in a sense, didn't disqualify him in New York. But he didn't campaign on that. He campaigned on the cost of living and the need for change. So he was clearly the change candidate addressing cost of living. Did we see recently a national political figure lie his way into becoming the change candidate on the cost of living? But I also think in some ways New York is special. It is a city of immigrants. And so it brings that perspective of the world that, you don't find in the more parochial parts of America. And also, again, remember what a remarkable job he did in turning out young people. And I think among young people, certainly on the coasts, there is a sensibility that is just instinctively anti-imperialist, just as it is instinctively tolerant of difference. I've often said if we can get through the next 15 years, if we can, not sure we can.
We, the world, we, the States.
We, America, I actually have faith because I think the upcoming generations are just so much more sophisticated, smarter, tolerant than, the old folks in dominant positions in America. But we have to get through the next 15 years. And I don't know. I really don't know. I hope we can. But I think it's an open question about American democracy.
Get into Mamdani's head if you can. He's getting tested now around his words. He's very adroit, but he's on a bit of a pickle there on this matter of where does he stand on globalizing the Intifada. How does that play for an organizer like you and a strategist like you? We've got to talk about strategy and all this.
I mean, strategy is critical. I go through in the book the amazing weakness that I had, that I spent 10 years opposing the war in Vietnam, and it wasn't until year 8 that I actually had a serious set of discussions about how does the war end. Not what are our demands, not what are our tactics, but how do we end the war? And we finally settled on, we cut off funds through Congress. Such a boring, simple solution. But it happened, and the war came to an end. Now, strategy is absolutely critical. So let's go to Gaza. I'm not an expert, though I feel really clearly that what has been done to Gaza is an inconceivable crime. I also feel very clearly, by the way, that what was done on October 7th was a crime, and that my view is a child's life is a child's life, and that no child is more important, no child is less important. So that means no Palestinian child is less important than an Israeli child. Equally, no Israeli life is less important than a Palestinian life. Why do I say that? Because, one, if you don't keep to the moral high ground, you're not going to win. Two, if you're not uniting people and figuring out how to broaden the effort, you're not going to succeed. Again, I'm an old guy. I'm not in the trenches about this. But if I was, organizing around the war in Gaza, I would be asking always, how do we get that war to an end? And one, we have to have the broadest possible movement in the United States, pressuring for an end to the U.S. support. I'd also say I think there's no chance under the Trump administration that we're going to get the pressure on the Israelis to end what they've done in Gaza.
We surely weren't going to get it under a Biden administration either.
No, we weren't, but I think we'd had a better chance. So, again, I go back to my 1968. No confusion about Harris. She's going to end the war in Gaza. No, but she is more likely to be susceptible to the kind of pressure we could bring to end the war in Gaza than Trump was. I would have liked to have seen activists around Gaza hold two imperatives equally in their mind. One is the absolute imperative to educate, act, organize to stop the war in Gaza. The other was the absolute imperative to stop fascism in the United States. And I believe that the current regime we have is in fact fascist. And if we'd had both those in mind, I think we might have acted differently.
On the matter of strategizing and thinking strategy all the time, tell the story about your own participation in an anti-Vietnam War rally in Lowell, Massachusetts, with your wife in, I think it was the spring of 1970.
So what happened was, in 1968, I was increasingly concerned with the gulf between the families and the communities that bore the hardest price for the war and the anti-war movement, and there was just an enormous gulf between them. So we started organizing in state and community colleges where Vietnam veterans were coming back in large numbers, and many of those Vietnam veterans were against the war. And through that, I worked with a team to put organizers into Lynn, Lowell, Fall River, Worcester, and Dorchester. And they decided that it was time for the first anti-Vietnam War march in Lowell, and asked me to come up and be there for it. And Amy, my wife at the time, came with me. So our march started off and very quickly was broken up by these guys throwing bricks, wielding 2x4s, and we had to make the decision, this is a disaster, people are getting hurt, let's break the march and send people away. It begins to quiet down, and in come a few guys to try and get their friends who've been arrested. And we're sitting on the bench with them, and we start talking with them. And they're all Vietnam vets. They're also all members of the UE, one of the left unions, in a plant in Lowell. They are absolutely against the war, but they were absolutely against our marching. And we get into a discussion with them. Why?
And your flag.
Yeah, you had, they said, we respected the Viet Cong. They were tough people to fight. They used another word. And, we respected them. But you don't march under their flag in our city. That dishonors the sacrifices that we made and our friends who died. You also had women all marching together, chanting Ho Ho Chi Minh. What is that? And why do you have women sort of, in our face? What is that? And we got into a really good discussion. We probably stayed there 45 minutes. And they say, okay, we're going to walk you to your car to protect you. Because we'd had an honest discussion about the war. And in that moment, I realized so much of what we were doing was just so wrong. Symbols matter. Now I could go back, we'd only march under American flags, and we would only be singing, America the Beautiful. Symbols matter, and engaging people and not confronting them and not preaching and not thinking about their experience and how to connect with their experience. So we organized lots of Vietnam vets after that, and many of them became part of something called Vietnam Veterans Against the War.
Of course, John Kerry's glory.
Yeah.
There's this other question of the redeemable country. Quick digression. We had a wonderful conversation with Marilynne Robinson, the novelist. She's written 4 novels about a single made-up composite town, Gilead, in Iowa in the 1950s, 60s. The last one is called Jack, and the hero is a complete ne'er-do-well, a bad guy, a drinker, a failure, but we know and she knows and he knows that he's redeemable. Nobody's giving up on him. It's always good news, a good time when he comes home. His father is always thrilled to see him, his sisters too. But that notion of an irredeemable country, or no, a country needing something, leadership or guidance, is a big difference. I want to know how you came from the irredeemable picture of the country to, no, people can change. Even masses of people can change.
So let me go back to my youth. I grew up loving American history, and I believed profoundly in American exceptionalism. I did. I actually thought Americans were the tallest, most athletic, and most generous people in the world. You know, very parochial view, a very insular view, but I did believe it. And my activism, you know, why I got into that picket line in support of the Greensboro sit-in students, it was because of my love of America. I mean, I actually thrilled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I would sit there and think, pursuit of happiness, what an interesting, strange, unique phrase. And the idea that people from all over the world came to this country and made it what it was. And yes, I understood what happened to Native Americans. Yes, I understood about slavery deeply. But I still was in love with the country. Then, during the Vietnam War, I feel like that love was destroyed. Not just about Vietnam, but we learned about Guatemala. We learned about Iran. We learned more about Reconstruction and Jim Crow. And we came to that place where we thought America is irredeemable. And when you think the country is irredeemable, it's all or nothing. And that's usually nothing. So what saved me was organizing. What saved me was I was back talking to people very different than myself. And I could see them change. And I could feel myself change. And I could see that as I was organizing, I was talking always about the possibilities of democracy, the possibilities of America. And that meant that organizing made me fall in love with the country again.
It's so interesting. And I take that kind of seriously, and it goes deep, that the practice of a tentative or unprovable belief leads you on, and it shows you the way.
Absolutely. And it's not a belief that's naive. I mean, I understand, for example, right now, we are suffering the most severe threat to the Constitution, to democracy and decency since the Civil War. I understand that. And there's a historical through line, by the way, with the forces that caused the Civil War and are active today. But I still believe that the vast majority of Americans are decent people and that they believe in decency. But the problem is they're getting massive misinformation. They've been ignored by the elites. I once was in a discussion with the CEO of Prime Computer, just by chance, social situation. Never met him before. And Prime Computer made computers in Massachusetts, and they employed something like 21,000 people. And I said to him, so what's the future for Prime? And he said, one word, China. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, we're moving our jobs to China. It's just a question of when. And I said, well, what about those 21,000 employees? And he said, I don't care. Literally, he said, I don't care. My job is to maximize profits. I don't care. That's happened over and over and over again with no help for those people who are unemployed, no help for those communities that were hollowed out, no help for the transition, and no strategy to create jobs. And instead, what we have is this insane inequality that is just rotting the country and rotting the democracy. I believe that can be changed. I don't know that we will win, but I believe we could win but what it takes, again, broken record, organizing.
Listening to whom and affiliating with whom?
So I think there's going to be a whole new generation of leaders like Mamdani, but in all sorts of ways. You know, they're going to be city council people in Iowa. They're going to be new organizers in North Carolina. I think there's a new generation that's going to come up, and we can't have them too soon. You know, old people like you and me, Chris, we should offer our support. We should offer whatever lessons we've gleaned. But, you know, it's time for young people to lead. I don't know who they'll be, but I do believe they'll be emerging more and more over these next 3 incredibly hard and difficult years.
I told you I thought the country was ready for Bernie Sanders against Donald Trump in 2020, just as a sign of life among the Democrats and something comparable to Trump's own recklessness about the old categories. What does it mean to ask or to say that this is still a centrist country?
I think the left-right dichotomy, which is so severe and is always talked about, really misses the point. Let's go back to Mamdani. Was his
He would correct you. And if you were Cuomo, he'd correct you rudely. He'd say it's Mamdani, right?
Mamdani. Was his program a left-wing program? Is free buses left-wing? Is, you know, a reasonable tax on the insanely rich left-wing? Is getting housing affordable left-wing? Is getting college and higher education to be accessible and not cost a fortune left-wing?
I think that's a good point. I mean, we are a pragmatic country above all, before we're left or right. See if it works.
Right. Try it. But the most important thing is have politicians who are authentic, who don't lie all the time, and talk about the issues that everybody's concerned about in their day-to-day life. And that's the cost of living, that's housing, that's healthcare. It is insane that in a country this rich, we don't have affordable healthcare for everybody. It is insane that there are millions of Americans who rely on food pantries for food. I mean, this is an unbelievably wealthy country. And yet its distribution is so skewed that it's a crime.
Are those 5 or 6 issues you'd organize around together, or are they 5 different organizing projects?
I think both. I mean, some of them will be campaigns like healthcare.
I was going to say healthcare, number 1.
Right. But I think also when you get into the electoral political sphere, there needs to be a comprehensive, clear, understandable agenda. And it has to be the agenda of people's lives, making their lives better, and it has to be an agenda of change. The strategic dilemma that we're in now is that Trump is attacking and destroying everything. So the natural impulse, which is the right impulse, is to try to defend those things that he's destroying. But if we only do that, we then are the defenders of a flawed status quo. And that's not going to beat Trump. What has to beat Trump is not only defense, but is saying, okay, don't destroy higher education, because higher education needs to be more accessible to everyone. And you're destroying it makes it less accessible to everyone. Don't destroy Medicare. Expand it, change it, make it so every American has affordable health care. Don't destroy HUD. Make a new HUD that really has a serious initiative at building affordable housing that young people all across America can either rent or buy. So we have to be proposing change at the same time that we are resisting Trump's unconstitutional, illegal, and indecent attacks on everything we care about.
Michael Ansara, you're a man of parts. We haven't mentioned that you're a poet. You and I made a podcast a few years ago around your poetry, but you also organized a remarkable thing called mass poetry, amateur, not exactly populist, but all sorts of people can take part and do. What's it like to organize around poetry as opposed to war?
Well, very, very different, very enjoyable, but not a completely dissimilar process. So the way we created mass poetry is the first thing we did was to hold 7 regional roundtables of poets and say, tell us what's on your mind. Tell us what you are wishing for. Tell us what you are hoping for. And out of that came a program, Mass Poetry Festival. Out of that came putting poets in schools. Out of that came a teen spoken word program. Because again, we started by listening, by not saying, oh, here's the program, we know what to do, but talking to people, involving them, and having a program that emerged from their hopes and their needs. And, I think in some ways that poetry might be a little bit of a metaphor for the American left. It retreated to the academy. And when it retreated to the academy, it became inaccessible to almost everybody. You'd read poets, maybe brilliant poets, but you'd go, I can't get into that. But when you get young people starting, say, doing spoken word and telling their truths, it's absolutely vibrant and accessible. And all sorts of people have their favorite poems. Robert Pinsky's done this wonderful favorite poem project.
Yeah.
But I talk to people and they'll say, oh, I don't read poetry, but I remember this one poem that just meant so much to me. I don't read poetry, but Mary Oliver just means so much to me.
Robert Pinsky made me realize how much I love Yeats's Song of Wandering Aengus. Michael, I've enjoyed your poetry festivals too. This is fun. This is the short course on organizing pretty much anything. It starts with listening. It's a great pleasure to read your book, 50 Years in the Organizing Game. Michael, thank you.
No, Chris, thank you, as always.
Pleasure. Michael Ansara's memoir of a lifetime in organizing is titled The Hard Work of Hope. You can search our open source website for the sound of Michael's poetry under his last name, Ansara, A-N-S-A-R-A. Our conversation here at Open Source relies on listener support. That's you. If you haven't done your part yet, now is the time. Go to radioopensource.org/donate and pitch in to keep the world's first and longest running podcast going strong. Leave a comment while you're at it. We are proud to be founding members of Hub and Spoke, a Boston-based collective of independent, creator-owned podcasts. Our shows range from history to technology to politics to art. We come together around the principle that independent voices and independently funded media are more important now than ever. You can learn more at hubspokeaudio.org. And thank you